Welcome to Friday the 13th LBA Roundtable. Can we learn from the statin revolution? My grandmother always said it was a lucky day, Friday the 13th, so that with all that's going on in the world, we can only hope. As most of you know, I'm Risa Starr, the Executive Director of the LBA. Want to welcome Nir back. He arrived back from Israel yesterday. I would also like to give a shout out to Michaela Ney. She is now managing our social media as of August 1st. And you might have noticed a huge improvement. I certainly have. I'm excited to introduce Jerry McLaughlin, the CEO of Life Biosciences. Life Biosciences is focusing on 3 platforms targeting key mechanisms underlying aging biology: mitochondrial uncoupling, chaperone-mediated autophagy, and epigenetic reprogramming. Jerry has vast experience in senior leadership positions at numerous pharmaceutical companies. We have invited him to talk to the LBA about the development of statins. Jerry joined Merck shortly after the launch of Mevacor. He was involved in the commercialization of Merck's statin drugs during the early years and evolution of the market. There are lessons to be learned as we enter clinical trials for geroscience therapeutics, and we're happy to have Jerry share them with us.
Thanks, Risa, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today to talk about this experience. And I've heard James speak about this several times, and we ended up having a conversation, and it was very near and dear to my heart from the early days of my career. I spent the first years of my career at Merck in a variety of commercial roles, and obviously during that time, the statin market was front and center. It was in its evolution. It became one of the really early big blockbuster markets. And James and I were discussing, and he thought it'd be a good idea to share that experience, because I think there are many lessons to be learned and insights for us as we think about the evolution of geroscience and where we are and where we can take it, and the challenges, hurdles, and opportunities. And I think I'll tell you up front, it's not easy work. It takes time, it takes investment, and it takes evidence. But I think there is a real hope here of what can be in the coming years and decades ahead for all of us and what we're looking to achieve. So James, I don't know if you have anything yet. If not, I have a few slides just to foster discussion from my history.
So I think as like a little bit of extra window dressing on like the setup for this, I first heard, like I would say this is now 7 or 8 years ago, Tom Rando of Stanford invokes statins as the closest thing that we have today to an eventual geroscience drug. And that resonated for me so strongly that I've been thinking about it and in some ways parroting that idea ever since. It's been a big part of my evolution in thinking about what these drugs will do as in terms of how they'll be developed clinically, as not longevity drugs, but as preventatives. And the importance of biomarkers can be reframed as like the importance of finding measurable risk factors for disease. And I think we have so much to learn from not just the generalities, but the specifics of statin development. And this is where our conversation started, Jerry, is that, you know, I have made a few comments about this, and then you pulled me aside at some point and you were like, yeah, but what about the specifics here? Like, what do you think about this and this? And I'm like, ooh, I don't know that much about the real history of this and what it was on the inside. And you're like, well, I do. And we got into it a little bit, and I was like, wow, this would be something so valuable for the community to think about and have, and really kind of like ascend one level in the depth of understanding. Maybe that's mixing metaphors, ascending the depth, but in any case. And so yeah, I think the format for today is that you've put together some slides on the actual history of this that I think would be best if I'll just disappear, let you go through those. And then I'll try to come up with some discussion points.
Great. Well, thanks, James. I'll jump into it, and I'll be quick. I have probably about 7 slides, just really touching on some of the history in areas I think would be relevant. So I'll pull that up now. Okay, great. So one thing up front, I'll be making statements on behalf of my own experience, and not necessarily, these aren't necessarily associated with Life Biosciences, even though they're Life Biosciences slides. So I thought I would just state that up front. So this is really interesting. This is from the FDA. And you'll hear me talk about this throughout, because I think this is a success story of academia, commercial, and government and the evolution and revolution here with statins. But this is from an FDA historian who the FDA actually published an article on this, showing that between 50% and 75% of Americans know their cholesterol number. And that being really a testimony to what has happened. And I can tell you that's rare in a disease to have such recognition among the general public. And I think we have that opportunity here in geroscience over time. We already have a head start. Folks are very keenly aware of aging and their desire to do something about it. But what I can tell you is back in 1990, very few knew what cholesterol was or knew anything about their number. And this is something that took years and decades, but it shows you what a great therapeutics. Therapeutics can not only be treating, but preventative and evidence and good commercialization time to make this a household name. And in today's world, everybody knows their cholesterol number. So I'll get to the punchline first. The success. It's unbelievable when you look at the totality of the statins. And these are the top 200 drugs prescribed in the US in 2020. And you look at, and these are just the top 5 statins. Almost 50 million Americans were prescribed a statin in 2020. It's phenomenally high, and over 200 million prescriptions. Near, I put this in here for you. Metformin's a number 3 prescribed medication in the United States. So I'm a big believer, and I think it's great that it's on the list there. But so we have this widely used, really, it's basically just part of our everyday lives as Americans, and obviously wouldn't be there if there wasn't benefit. And what's really interesting is looking at it commercially, despite the fact that just about every statin is generic, the market is still, the global statin market commercially is currently about 15 billion, and it's expected to continue to grow at a single-digit rate over the next 5 and even 10 years, which should exceed 20 billion by the 2030s. So it's a great example here of long-term commercial viability of a market, even in the case post-generic world. But now statins are ever present here in the US, and they're expected to grow. The biggest growth areas are in Asia, and it's really interesting. It ties to what we're doing. A big driver of that is obviously things like obesity and diabetes growth in the Asian world, but also the aging of the population is going to be a big driver here for statins. So this is sort of the punchline and where we've arrived, but the question is, how do we get here? And like any field, and I think we all can relate to this, there was a hefty amount of skepticism prior to the statins, and even probably in the early days. And we can often think about this in terms of aging, right? There were skeptics who were pointing out crucially important, essential component. We don't want to be altering it. We don't want to reduce it. All kinds of concerns came out of the woodwork in the scientific literature and in the halls of even the NIH and the FDA. However, over time, with evidence, there were members in the NIH and FDA who became believers, and believers in the face of all the skepticism, and they created support from the government with funding to support ongoing trials. They believe that if you could lower cholesterol substantially, it could help people from dying from high blood cholesterol. Despite the lack of evidence, right? I think they held to the fact that lack of evidence isn't a reason not to plow forward. And jumping ahead, and I'll talk about this more. It was in 1994, the really seminal study for the field. It was actually with the third triptan. There had been 2 triptans. It was after Mevacor and after a drug called pravastatin from Bristol Myers Squibb. Merck invested in their second statin, simvastatin, and really this is what broke the seal. And have it being on the front lines and seeing this, it's really, there was the day before this, it was called the Forest study, and the day after, because for the first time showed that statins really could revolutionize the treatment of heart disease, reducing death from any cause, reducing heart attacks, reducing strokes, morbidity, mortality, you name it. It was all there in a well-controlled, sizable study. And it really set this class on a path to the results you see today. But as you see with a large study, it's not without significant investment. And here's what you hear today, right? This is Johns Hopkins cardiologist. You know, early on, we just viewed it as purely cholesterol-lowering drugs, right? That's it. It was just to treat, right? It was a treatment. And then over time, this evolved into, we started thinking about proactively and prevention. How do we stop? How do we risk reduce? How do we extend life? How do we avoid heart attacks? And sort of the paradigm really shifted over time because of the benefits of these drugs and laying in the evidence as well. So it really was a seminal day in the history of the statins. And we'll talk a little bit more about the timeline in a second, but I just wanted to give you a little insight in that it wasn't always this way. And there was a time, and I can tell you in my early days, talking to a rural internal medicine physician, said to me, I only treat patients with cholesterol over 400 because cholesterol is like motor oil for the arteries. It's good for the body. It keeps it going. And so that was a mindset, outside of cardiology, for many primary care physicians in the late 80s. And boy, we've come a long way. So here's a little of the history, and I'll make this the last slide here today, but just talking about how the FDA and academia and industry work together. And I won't really get into the history prior to the 80s, but there was a whole host of studies and failures and setbacks that we've all experienced, right? There were a lot of safety concerns with some of the early editions of statins, and issues with eye, liver, and it really set it back to the point that Merck actually discontinued what ended up being Mevacor. They discontinued lovastatin temporarily, but the FDA reached out to them and encouraged them to continue in a high risk population initially in some initial trials. And so this was almost dead before it was actually those in the FDA who were very helpful. But there was a evolution here. So even as of the early 1980s, there was this sort of just this treatment of elevated LDL was a conjecture, right? It was known as the lipid hypothesis, and we have our the hypothesis of aging, right, in our field. But not much was really believed. That there was a lot of skepticism around this. If we lower this, could it have real benefit? What are we doing here? And one from a government supported study, and I won't, you can read all the letters, but basically this was a large, lengthy outcomes trial of over 7 years with nearly 4,000 middle-aged men with risks. They were at risk for cardiovascular disease, and all they had were dietary changes, and they weren't treated with lovastatin, which ended up being Mevacor. They were a drug called cholestyramine, bile acid sequestrants. And so they were treated for 7.3 years, and they saw modest reductions in cholesterol and modest reductions in cardiovascular outcomes. But this was enough to really, the basis here, this was the initial foundation of proving the hypothesis that cholesterol reduction could have an impact on cardiovascular events. And then after decades of work, Brown and Goldstein, they received a Nobel Prize for their work. They really dug into the regulation of LDL cholesterol metabolism and the role of the liver, which is where the statins work. And so these two cases of academia and the government really laid a strong level of baseline evidence, which then after that, Merck went full steam ahead with the blessing of the FDA, and they quickly moved into phase 3 trials. They submitted their NDA to the FDA in late 1986, and I think it was the first 10-month approval in the history of the FDA. The FDA was eager to get this out, so they became advocates when there was skepticism, not just 10 years earlier. And so in September of 1987, the FDA approved Mevacor, but it was interesting. It wasn't to treat a disease. It was the surrogate endpoint of lowering LDL cholesterol. And so that was really a novel concept. And I think it really gives us insights, right, as we think about aging. And I think that'll be part of the discussion later. But I think it's an important concept to see here is that the FDA was willing to go forward with a surrogate endpoint in the belief that down the road there could be further evidence. And that evidence really didn't come, as I mentioned earlier, until about 7 years later when that 4S trial came to be. Subsequent to that, just a host of additional points of evidence came over the next 10 or 15 years, showing both primary and secondary prevention for the statin class in treating and preventing cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. So it's a really, I think, a good story, and I won't get into it in too much detail. Always happy to talk to someone offline in greater detail, but because of the nature of our event here and the time, I really just wanted to touch on it at a high level and really point to the fact that once again, it was this confluence of FDA, academia, and industry working together to push this forward. The other, I think, point is, while I think we may not like it, it's really is a stepping stone approach, and it's an evidence-based business. And even back in the 1980s, it was. And it wasn't until we generated these large outcomes trials that we really moved the market forward, because the market was substantial in the early days, but it didn't become the behemoth until these additional points of evidence were generated. I can tell you at Merck, when the 4S trial came out, the market just jumped in size and scope, and the usage levels, the prescription levels, it really then completely feathered out from just specialist and some use in primary care to broad-based application, proactive screening of patients, actively engaging in conversations with patients instead of waiting until their cholesterol was either extremely high or they had a cardiovascular event. So just really, it changed the game overnight. So I'll stop there and just leave this as a base for our discussion going forward, and I'll turn it back over to James.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent kind of jumping off point. Maybe we can do, keying off of this, I have sort of a few things that I'd love to dig into, probably centered around two key topics that I think are interrelated with each other. And the first one is around organizations and people that were needed in order to make this thing happen, right? So one of the pieces of the story that you just told us, Jerry, that jumps out to me was the FDA being proactive and like reaching out to Merck to say, hey, we want you to do this. So I wonder if you could give or if we could look a little bit at what was going on inside of Merck, and then talking a little bit about the specifics of the different groups, the different orgs that were involved here. So like within Merck, was there this organizational sense that like, hey, we have this amazing drug, we want to use this for prevention, we want to go earlier and earlier, or was that pull coming from outside?
Yeah, I think it was definitely, in some ways, from both sides, right? Because the government was, the FDA and government agencies were supporting these with funding, were supporting the long-term outcome study. So they knew there was something there, and they knew it was in the benefit of society and the health of society to examine the role of cholesterol in cardiovascular disease. However, it was perseverance and a push also from companies like Merck, and Merck was led at the time by Roy Vagelos, who was just a legend in the field. And Merck was very academically focused, right? The company had a very academic feel to it, and a research feel. And so they were very close and worked and listened to academia, as well as had strong relationships within NIH. And so I think they leveraged those relationships to co-develop a plan, right, to generate the evidence. And the fact that they were able to, well, I'll step back for a second, because there was, there was a time in which lovastatin was terminated. It was flat out terminated. It was being developed in Japan for Merck, and they ran into some concerns and they terminated the program. But then the FDA came to Merck, right? And I think that's part of that relationship, right? I think that's an opportunity for our field as well. It's building understanding, building sort of a partnership of where we need to take this and what's in the benefit for patients. And so I think that led, Merck was very focused on that my whole time there in government relations, FDA relations, NIH relations. So I think that that was a big push. But Merck saw the commercial opportunity as well, James. And Vagelos had said well before the launch that he could see this as being their first billion-dollar product, right? And I think he stated this back in the early 1980s. So,
and he was right.
He was right.
Interesting. So this kind of dual pull happened. Do you think that? Let me ask a slightly different question. One of the things that you didn't mention that I was surprised to see the absence of in this presentation was the Framingham Heart Study. You talked a little bit about the lipid hypothesis, but I think your story kind of starts with the existence of this thing called the lipid hypothesis. So I wonder if we should take like almost that half step back and say, okay, well, in order to get here, right, where FDA says, hey, we think that this is actually going to work, we can like take that sort of leap of faith, where a group like Merck can sort of say, we've got the drug, we've developed it, and now we believe this too. Like, let's do like a little poking into what needed to happen in order to gain conviction across these big orgs.
Well, I think, and I went back and actually did some additional research, right? Because my scope was limited, and there had been a lot of groundwork laid in academia on this whole lipid hypothesis, and I beginning even the 1940s, right? So there was decades of work. The Framingham Heart Study, which I believe, James, if I'm correct, I remember it was a big part of what we, from a marketing perspective, we used to help build the market. I believe it was in the 1950s. I'm correct. Very
started in the 50s and then it continued all the way through.
Yeah. So I think that was critical from a market development standpoint. I think the scientific evidence was probably more compelling. Agency.
So by scientific, do you mean specifically like the mechanistic evidence, like the HMG-CoA reductase?
That's right.
Characterization.
Work of Brown and Goldstein and others. I think that probably had more impact with the FDA. I think the Framingham study had a great impact on market development, supporting market development. But what I can say is the Framingham study, as strong as it was, it really wasn't. I think it helped get the market off the ground. It was the hard evidence with simvastatin and ultimately then with atorvastatin that really rocketed this market, right? Gave clinicians and reset how they viewed approaching cholesterol from a treatment perspective to a preventative perspective.
So that gets into the next thing that I wanted to touch on. As kind of the big topic of what I'm going to call biomarker first versus outcome first. So one of the big takeaways is that, in 87, you had this NDA for lowering cholesterol as a surrogate biomarker endpoint. So first, were there any statin approvals before 87 for outcome focused things, or was this the first statin approval that was actually the first approval was for the surrogate endpoint?
This was the first statin approved. You had clofibrates and you had cholestyramine, right, bile acid sequestrants, which were approved to lower cholesterol as well.
Yep.
But as far as this was the first, lovastatin was the first statin, and it was approved based on a surrogate endpoint. And it really made we look at it today and you wouldn't believe that it would happen that way. But and being on the commercial side, we were it was very clear that that's all we could communicate with clinicians and healthcare professionals.
And so
lower cholesterol.
And so even as you think about indications, right? In my reading of the early statin literature, a lot was talking about familial hypercholesterolemia, rare orphan diseases. Was the direction more geared to lowering cholesterol in those diseases? Or was it like, hey, that's an area where certainly everyone has very high LDL cholesterol in those diseases, but people with heart disease and other folks can also have high LDL, and like the drug went out basically to both groups at the same time?
So it's a classic case where the opportunity was much larger than the reality of what could be achieved and realized in the beginning. And it's sort of like that, you start at the tip of the iceberg and that familial hypercholesterolemia, family history, you know, there's folks, they die early, right? You know, they die. They have heart attacks, they die. And so that was an easy slice. However, frankly, from a commercialization standpoint, that was not the focus at all.
Mhm.
It was how do we burrow in and really help clinicians understand, you know, the benefit of lowering cholesterol. And I would say the way it in the early years, it was dominated by cardiology, then endocrinology, and then internists, and then moving to your broad primary care. And so it took time. It took time, but the emphasis was not, while it was an strong point of the hypothesis for the small population, the orphan population, it would be extremely limiting if the emphasis was on that on that small population.
Absolutely. So I know Nir popped up at some point, and I'm sure he has questions. I want to get to kind of like one more set of things I'd love to draw out of you, which is like, if we wanted to sort of prognosticate about some of the lessons that the geroscience field should learn from this narrative and the history of statins, like maybe we can ping pong back and forth a little bit and think about like between 1 and 3 like key takeaways. The first one that's on my mind that I'm curious whether you would agree with is that while biomarkers can be really powerful, the mechanistic link between a biomarker and the disease, the outcome, and the drug, that seems to be what's going to allow people to unite, scientists to unite around this, not just a general sort of general hypothesis like the lipid hypothesis, for example.
I agree wholeheartedly. Absolutely.
I think that in and of itself represents a really interesting strategic direction, right? It sort of, I've been a big fan, for example, of aging clocks and the whole epigenetic, not reprogramming, but the epigenetic clock measurement, right? The Horvath clocks and so on. But such a thing would suggest that, you know, because those don't have mechanistic links to any specific drug directly, that's probably going to be harder for someone to take a leap of faith on. Whereas if you're measuring, let's say, autophagy, and you have a drug that impacts autophagy, or you're measuring senescent cells and you have a drug that impacts senescent cells, that linkage is probably where you're going to be able to bring people around the table a little bit more productively as a strategic approach.
I agree. And so let's say you may come at that from 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 different angles, right? But as long as your sort of mechanism is the same, I think you have a much better opportunity, right? Because when you think back to how Merck was able to get that surrogate endpoint, one of the big contributors, and this has been documented by the FDA and in their history papers, but others, that it was the cholestyramine study, right? A bile acid sequestration. But at the end of the day, it was lowering cholesterol, right? It was the same end benefit. That was a big driver for the FDA to get comfortable with the surrogate endpoint. But then you combine that with Brown and Goldstein really driving in on the mechanism.
Yep. Interesting. Yeah, and that kind of all goes towards the same kind of mechanistic validation of the lipid hypothesis that gets stronger and stronger data. All right. Do you have another kind of like takeaway that you would love people to sort of learn from this narrative, or make sure we don't forget history? And then I'm going to open it up.
I think we have to confront the reality that it's an evidence-based business, and it takes time and money. And I think this, to me, has always reinforced that, you know, James, as you talk about it, and I totally agree, is the stepping stone approach. We have to build value and then create evidence, or more evidence, continue to build on the evidence, right? And that takes capital and time, you know, and so I think we have to plan accordingly, and to overpromise is setting up the field and or your company, right, for disappointment. So I think that's a big lesson, and that's sort of how we approach. We're taking the approach of being very focused on age-related disease, you know, showing benefit in a disease, showing that we can reverse it, and then from there it's an expansion through evidence. That separate from that, I think I look at Nir. I've always been a big fan. I'm not just saying it. I'm not pandering to you, Nir, but I think, boy, your study is, I think, markedly, it's so important for the field, and I think the value it can bring in changing mindset, even though it's in one specific medication and one specific mechanism. I think it has the opportunity in the relatively short term to change a mindset. And so I think when I look back to the history, there are seminal studies that maybe get forgotten in the long run, but they were instrumental in changing a paradigm and changing a mindset, not just for a company, but for regulators, right? It changes the mindset. And I think the other lesson I would have, and it's something, we're still young and we don't necessarily have all the resources, but starting to build advocacy within our regulatory bodies, which, let's face it, are also political bodies. And starting to forge those relationships and make them ever stronger. And I know there are some here on the call who've been doing that. I think the more we can as an organization, as LBA and beyond, is only going to serve our purpose down the road. Once again, it's a patient and persistent game. It's not what we all like to hear all the time, but it's a mission, and we're on a long mission here. And hopefully we'll have wins in the short term, but I think ultimately to win the game, we have to be thinking about our relationships, not just the academic relationship, which are fantastic, but thinking about regulatory, which is a political body.
Well, I think that's awesome. Nir, I wanted to hand things over to you. I saw your video flip on, please.
Yeah, thank you. Listen, that was really an important exercise, because it's better not to invent the wheel. And I think the statin story is very relevant to us, because eventually what we want to do is prevent aging and not get to the diseases. And that's been proven. My concern, or the things we have to actually understand, because there's a lot of people who are saying, hey, there's statin, why do we need you? And I think we have to make sure that people understand that statin is not a gerotherapeutic. It's not a gerotherapeutic because it doesn't hit any of the hallmarks of aging. And when you give it to animals, almost 10 animals, there's one exception, one study, nematode, that others didn't show that. But in all animals, you give them statins and they don't live longer. And actually, when you look at the data beginning with the 4S studies, metformin had effect on cardiovascular events. It had effect on cardiovascular mortality, but not on overall mortality, which we have for metformin and SGLT2. And so, in fact, people thought, okay, maybe you don't die from heart disease, but you die from other things. I had a paper about a decade ago that showed that people who use statins have 40% increased risk of diabetes. The 4S study showed that people on statins have more suicide. Now, I'm not saying that all is necessarily true, but it's not a gerotherapeutic. So we just have to make clear that, look, statin got us somewhere. We have left heart disease, but even statin prevents only 30% of the heart attacks. We have to prevent the rest of them. And I think we know what to do next. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't use statin as if it's a gerotherapeutic.
That's completely right, Nir. I think and I'm curious if Jerry, you would agree with this, but for me, the big lessons and the ones that I wanted to focus in on are more regulatory. How do you go and get a primary and secondary preventative approved and then commercially widely adopted? And then second is more organizationally, like what's possible to, if we have this idea, because like the similarities, even though it's not a gerotherapeutic, the similarities are there between prevention and the stepping stone approach and so many of the pieces that have become the core strategies for the longevity biotech community. What lessons can we really learn of another group, another modality, and a completely, different, but in some ways related field that has been historically successful now that we're trying to build a new field?
Look, I totally agree. I think this is a great example. Also, the fact that we need more of the public and more of the government, and the FDA has to help us. I mean, it's all really similar. I should tell you another anecdote to consider for us. I was in the National Advisory Board for Merck, and one of our advisory board meeting was whether statins should be sold over the counter. You know, the safety was kind of established and stuff like that. And so there were a bunch of doctors, and I have to say, I was for, yeah, it should be sold over the counter, because there are other things that have side effects that are sold over the counter, right? Aspirin. But it was just interesting for me how doctors were conservative and basically saying, no, we have to see the patient, we have to check liver function after, things that have been shown to be kind of rare and things. But we also have to expect that whether it's nutraceutical or something else, the doctors, we have to work on them and make them, and we have challenges when it'll come to gerotherapeutics or nutratherapeutics.
Yeah, there was always the historic. It's interesting. When I was saying about there were questions whether statins would ever make it. There were issues with some of the early versions, with vision, liver has always been an issue. Muscle weakness, rhabdomyolysis that's a real issue, right? So I think those were some of the concerns. That, in fact, when we launched Mevacor, patients were instructed to get a slit lamp examination. They'd see their ophthalmologist once a year to get an eye exam, which I think there's an important point you bring up. We should realize that as we're looking at elderly populations and potentially broad populations, we will face the scrutiny on a safety perspective, just like all these other large classes.
Right, and metformin had same things that eventually were, how many millions of people didn't get metformin because of liver and kidney indication that could have actually saved them. It's actually well established in the literature. So that's true. We of course hope that if we have a drug that is a true gerotherapeutic, it will have less of problems. The major side effect will be longevity, right? And not something else.
I want to bring us, I think, towards the end. We wanted to have like a nicely contained little discussion here. The only sort of shout out that I wanted to do, in addition to thanking Jerry for putting this together, doing some extra research as well on statins, is that one of the things that got me a little bit deeper in this topic, because there's a book from a few years ago by Safi Bakal called Loon Shots, that I have not heard many folks in this community talk about. But one of the numerous vignettes in this book is actually about the origin of lovastatin. And it starts with like the Japanese scientists that Jerry mentioned, and Safi's overall kind of like framework is that all great innovations die 3 deaths on their way to success. And we heard a little bit about some of those deaths today. But that book has I think probably a less of an insider perspective, but more of like an outsider's perspective of what was going on through this framework, and might be worth checking out for some of you listening to this who want to dive in.
There's a great Roy Vagelos in an interview with the CEO. They had already proclaimed this was going to be $1 billion product. The phone call back in the 70s or early 80s from Japan, the head of research had to make a phone call to tell him we're terminating the program. Could you imagine making that phone call?
That is something else.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, I just want to thank you again so much for offering to do this and sharing your experience and knowledge with the LBA community.
Okay. No, thank you for the opportunity. Happy to talk about it and love what this organization does. Really supportive.